So this is a talk of some work I had done at a Fortune 100 insurance company that started about 4 years ago and culminated about a year ago. And the good and bad news is when I worked for them, I couldn't come tell you this story because I could never get through legal and the 29 signatures I needed to speak in public. And they would have went through every slide and took off half the words, and it wouldn't have been the same. So, but now, thankfully, my new employer is more inclined to allow us to get out and share these kinds of stories. And it has really very little to do. This is not a product pitch in any way. This is really, how we got started with really what was a DevOps effort, right? We were like a lot of companies that are probably like a lot of you that are at this conference because there's what's here, CI/CD. All right, that's the Holy Grail. We all want to get to CI/CD. We just figure if we can figure that out and figure out all the tools, then life's going to be better. And what I'm suggesting is there's a way where people struggle is just how to start. What do you do first? How do you get the little wins that can justify the funding that could get you to get to where you really need to be? And so that's why Jenkins is key here, because I was able to use Jenkins and both build and deploy. The price was right. And then some other free tools around it. At the time we were using Subversion, which was free, the free version of our software now, Nexus. And that was my whole software factory. So this is really about, like I think a lot of you, the software factory, right? That's what we're here for, CI/CD. And how, though, can we make that a DevOps thing? Because we all know DevOps is 90% people, 10% tools. And I've sort of openly beefed with a lot of the DevOps community over the years that tools are still really important. To me, it reminds me a little bit of Uncle Bob Martin back in the Agile days saying, yeah, they can pick their tools, but there's certain things you just got to have, like unit testing, right? Nobody's going to challenge that you have to have unit testing. So my whole theory here was that the software factory was really foundational to the whole cultural aspect of DevOps, right? Like it becomes the thing that can actually drive the cultural change, even though we're talking about tools. And there's some reasons for that. One is we can use it as a form of transparency when we start to put things in the factory. Instead of having a bunch of silos with a bunch of secrets about what they do, we now have a view of the whole system. Now we're starting to talk about it, so now we're collaborating. And then there's an opportunity, obviously, to raise quality. And then at the end, I'll show you, I'll share with you sort of the benefits we had and how that led to increased funding. So at the end of the thing for me is the software factory is the first way, right? So if you were down listening to Gene Kim, it's how we get things through, right? The software factory is how code becomes a product. And, and eventually how it gets to prod, how it gets in the hands of your customer. Now, there's some little upstream, design and portfolio selection, but this is our assembly floor. And we all want to, most of us are in shops that look like that, where everyone's doing things by hand, and we all want to get to someplace here where everything's automated and there's a distinct lack of humans in that picture. But my point is they have very different cultures. And it's because they have very different tooling and they have a very different process, right? So the culture in each of those shops is going to be different. So we're going to explain why this first way and focusing on it can help drive the culture. And just to level set a little bit, this is not going to be a DevOps solution. That's why I call it the minimum viable product. For anyone who hasn't seen this drawing before, this is a great drawing because it really helps you understand that if you're trying to build a car, sometimes doing a skateboard first is a great place to start. See how wheels work. I'm going to say this solution might be a bicycle, right? It's a pretty good start, but it's by no means a complete view of the DevOps solution. And so one of the things that really got me started was, and I still just absolutely love the 2014 State of the DevOps report. I really think it was a seminal report. It really did a lot for us. But I also felt they got it wrong. This is off their findings they showed at Velocity after they published the report. And in that top left, they're saying continuous delivery and version control. And I actually believe continuous delivery is a superset of automated testing. So to me, this diagram doesn't make any sense. And I think what they meant to say, or what it should say, is deployment automation. And what we're going to focus on in this minimum viable product is just two sort of concepts. We're going to version all of our artifacts, right? The version control piece, which that was the big shock finding of this report, right? That versioning your artifacts is more important than versioning your source code. And we're going to use deployment automation as the way to break down the silos, because the minute you start trying to do that, you've got to talk to a whole bunch of people to make it possible. And this is how I sort of looked at the problem domain. This was, I used to call this like an orthogonal matrix. This was directly sort of lifted from continuous delivery, right? So 4 years ago, I was reading continuous delivery, still relatively new then. And they talked about the value stream, or the being build, deploy, test, release. They talk about that a lot in the book. And they also talked about apps can be functionally decomposed into code, config, and data. Almost every app can be thought of in those terms. And just to be clear, we're not solving for dynamic provisioning of environments or platforms, although we did have a parallel effort going on in that private cloud space. And we were starting to partner with a lot of the platform teams on how they could automate their provisioning process. And our thinking was, if I could make a button that could do this, and they could make a button that could do the platform, and someone else can make a button that can do the OS, pretty soon you just make another button that calls 3 buttons, and that you would get you there at the end. So even though we weren't trying to solve it all, we were doing it in parallel, somewhat separately. We felt at the end we could get there. So this is the drawing I like to use I use this a lot. If you've talked to me in my booth, I probably showed you a variation of this drawing. To me, this looks like the solution domain, a conceptual view of the solution domain, in that this is pretty familiar, right? Source code control, a build system, a binary repository there in the middle, and then some kind of release automation. If you're here for CD, right, you got to get rid of your manual automation. You want to get to something automated. There's some vendors out there like Zebia and that. But the great news is, to get started, Jenkins can fill both roles, right? Jenkins can be your CI pipeline, and you can turn around and have some workflows that will do the delivery piece too. And again, the price is right. So right now, I have no cost of failure, right? Every tool in my chain is free, and I'm gonna go out there and start, going for the Holy Grail of a zero-touch deploy for everything. And that's the whole point. For us, we just focused on one app, and the whole goal was just to demonstrate the art of the possible, right? Like, to prove that it could be done to this stodgy old insurance company that, when you talked about this, everyone was convinced that, like Gene Kim talks about, it's like, it's immoral. Like, you can't do that. There's 100 reasons why you can't do that in a big insurance company. But that was the start of a conversation. So like I said before, we're focused on every build was a release candidate, and I'm hearing this more and more in all the shops I walk into, especially in the Java world where snapshots were popular for a while. Now everything's being versioned. Our goal with my team was, we couldn't touch anything, right? We had to be one button. Everything had to happen. So that meant shut down the environment, do all the updates, and bring it all back up, right? And the app we chose, it was one app, but it was probably like 5 databases and a couple of ears and a war, right? It was a pretty good system. The key is you have to do code, config, and data together. And we'll get into a little bit more why that is. You can't just automate code deploys and the config. If you don't get the code and the data in particular traveling together, the schema updates, it just doesn't pay off. And we'll get in a little more into, when we talk about the outcomes, we'll hear a little bit more why that is. Like I said before, you can use Jenkins in the ARA space at first. I'm not so sure it's a really good long-term solution. But like I said, the price is right. It has a SSH plugin. You can get there, right? You can demonstrate the art of the possible with it, and that's why it's sort of the key element in this solution, because other than a Subversion and a Nexus repository, really, Jenkins is doing all the heavy lifting. And the other thing we had to start doing was, and this was something everybody had wanted, and it just didn't exist, was create a view of what's where. That magical list of what version of what things in what environment. And being in a big insurance company, we had lots of environments. They loved environments. We had like 9 environments on the way to Broad, It was insane. Because it was like every time they had a problem, they felt like the only way to solve it was to make a new environment for it. And there was this constant tension of, we had 9 environments, and they were constantly saying, well, we need a 10th and an 11th. And as the guy that was responsible for moving all that, I'm like, no, please stop, But so we created a view, and this is, again, where Jenkins came in. We also were, we had the Atlassian suite, right? So we used Confluence. We had a wiki, and there's a nice plugin for Jenkins that could go update a wiki page. If you got to sort of specially format it, you kind of tokenize it, and it can go inject values in. So if I was using Jenkins to deploy version 1, it could also have a step in there that would go update the wiki and say, I just put version 1 of the code in whatever environment it was, right? So it was smart enough to do that. This was a huge game changer all by itself, because as the guy that was responsible for, being the code steward, right, for moving stuff around, I found that we had different words depending on who I talked to when they asked me for code. Some people say, well, we want the May release. Some people would talk to it by the major feature. Some people just say, well, give me whatever QA just did. Or my least favorite, and the bane of my 18-year career in this space, was latest. Give me the latest. And I look at it and say, well, so wait, are you asking me for what QA just approved? Are you asking me for what the developer just tested in dev? Or did you talk to someone who's about to commit some code and there's a build about it? Because I don't know what latest means, But just by starting this, now I had people prescriptively asking me things. They say, Kurt, I want version 2.1. I want that list from QA. I need it up in SIT, right? And we started prescriptively talking about the pieces we wanted to move and where we were moving them. And this is simplified, but even just the fact that there was, in my world, there was like the 3 pieces of code. Each one had config, and there was about 5 pieces of databases, 5 different databases. That was like an eye-opener to a lot of people on the team. They had no idea the system actually looked like that behind the scenes. So they started to have a little bit more appreciation for what we were doing, because they used to think, well, how hard is a code? You move some code, update the database, you're done, right? They didn't realize there was like 8 things to do. But deployment automation is where it gets really interesting. Anyone can set up a build system. Any development team can, under their desk, set up Jenkins or whatever and set up a build system. You don't even have to get approval, right? You don't have to fight anyone to do that. But when you start to do deployment automation in a large company, now it gets interesting, because that's where everything is highly segmented, right? There's the middleware people just do the middle-ware. And if you had multiple pieces of middleware, you were dealing with different people for each one. Obviously, the ops DBAs, they were their own thing. The sysadmins were sort of out of the loop. But once we started talking about, hey, if I want to automate, I need to have my user ID become your user ID so I can, programmatically update a Tomcat server or something, right? So now I start having talks with the middleware engineers, the middleware support people, the production support people for the app on the app side, the ops DBAs. We had to start having these conversations with everyone, like, how do you do it now? How do I get Jenkins to take on your persona and execute a script, right? And so it was just the beginning of these kinds of dialogues in that space that is effectively starting to tear down some of the silos. We're now sharing with each other what it is we do. And before that, it was always a bit of a black box. We weren't really sure what they did. They just, they took their ticket and they eventually tell you it's done, and you go look at it, and of course it didn't work. But and so this was great, because now we're starting to map out the process. We're starting to visualize all the work, right? We're starting to talk about what the process is end to end, instead of the previous process, which was open a ticket and wait. Now it was, what are the things you do when you get that ticket? And let's talk about how we can work together to make that smoother. So this was what was really interesting. So as the code steward, and we didn't have good metrics, right? Because we didn't have, all this was being done with email and stuff, and we didn't have really good metrics. But we started going back. We literally went back through months and months of emails and started to create a narrative of the baseline metrics. And what we learned was about half of all of our deploys before this failed. It was like a 50-50 shot if whether or not the environment would come up. And it was almost always the same thing, but it would turn into a fire drill, right? If it was in one of those late environments where the business is really antsy to get that round of testing done, and it doesn't come up, our team was under heat, right? And it was like 50-50. You'd have to drag in some senior developers to do some kind of deep dive. They would spend hours to figure out that somebody forgot to update a column or a schema, and then therefore the code wouldn't come up, right? That was like almost always it. So what we saw was when we implemented this system, all of a sudden, the deployment times were getting cut in half. That's obvious, right? Because we're automating it, so all the times are shrinking. But the first time failures went from 50% to less than 10%, so about an 80% overall increase or decrease. And the other beauty of it was our mean time to detection on these failures was much faster. First of all, because it's a shorter time of deployment. If it didn't come up, we knew it. But the failure was almost now always, instead of code and config not being in sync, or code and data, it was almost always the config piece, because the config piece is the only thing we hadn't checked yet, right? We never worked with this config in this environment, and it would always be, someone forgot to update it. What started happening, though, is we would discover that almost always in QA, right? That next environment. Because in dev, someone would make the first config change, test it out, get it going. We'd go to promote it to QA. We'd realize we'd forgotten to update that property for every other environment. So instead of having these multi-hour deep dive sessions, I had junior guys, took 10 minutes to look at the config, realize we didn't propagate a change, propagate it, rerun the deploy, and we would get out of there in minutes, right? So we literally went from mean time to resolution from hours down to minutes. It was always pretty trivial, and when we fixed it in QA, we were pretty sure we were never going to see that problem again the rest of the way to prod, right? We were smart at that point. It's the dev to QA handoff is where, the developers, they never tell you everything, right? And when we started looking at all this in aggregate, we realized we had just taken 40% of our time that was being wasted, waiting for an environment to come up, figuring out why an environment didn't come up, making sure we got the right database in, spending hours on fixing it. When you took all that noise away, we had this 40% capacity just sort of given back to us. It was just pure productivity. And it started to change other things too. Because prior to this, and a lot of you probably feel this, everybody was always just trying to keep their head above water, right? We're working really hard, we're working long, everything's manual. And you just never have enough time to do all that other stuff that you need to do because you're so busy just trying to service the basic stuff. And so it started to have a profound effect because now people did have time to start thinking about technical debt, to start thinking about how to better improve the process, how to start to extend this to another piece of middleware or another type of database or ETL or something, right? So it was a huge change on a people level. They went from feeling sort of marginalized and not really valuable to now the tedium was taken off their plate and they got to focus on some higher value tasks. So no longer feeling overwhelmed. I like to tell the story of the deploy night. So my ETL team, their deploy night was always an all-nighter. It was an 8-hour thing. We always started at midnight on a Thursday. It always took them 8 hours. It was because you had to go click through the UI and move every package, right? It was really slow. And once we automated it, it went down to less than 2 hours. So now the guy's deploy night goes from an all-nighter to he's in bed by 2:30 in the morning. That's pretty reasonable for a late night shift in IT. And when we first engaged him, he was absolutely convinced that there was no way he could take on this extra sort of thing and support it. And once we got it in place, he realized, yeah, not only do I have the time to do this, I have even more time. I have even extra time during the day to work on other stuff or extend this now from Informatica to a data stage or start to look at other problems to solve. And that was the more interesting thing to me was the effect on the people, right? Because the people who went from feeling overwhelmed and fairly depressed, and I think Gene Kim talked about that this morning, all of a sudden now felt like engaged employees. They were like excited because we'd taken all this BS off their plate and they got to come to work, use their heads and go make things better. And it just changed their attitude a ton. And the other thing is, when you first talk about a button, there's nothing scarier to a big insurance company than a button. You'd think I was Ronald Reagan, ready to nuke the Russians, right? Like, you can't push a button, that's insane, it'll go to prod, what, But once they get it, once you give people that and they start to use it, they'll never go back. Once you get them hooked on that first couple buttons, they want more buttons. They want a button for everything. But the first one was really hard because it just seemed so scary to them. Like, what? You mean anybody could push this and it'll just update prod? That's insane. So we've now done the art of the possible. We've done a little bit. We have some ROI numbers. This is good. And then what we had to do is now we just realized, okay, My joke at this company was, we used to like to play a game. Name a piece of middleware, and I bet we own it. And if you could name a piece of middleware we didn't own, you won the bet. I don't think we ever quite found it. We owned everything. But so that was the thing. So we'd done JBoss, and then we started JBoss EAS, and then you start tackling a WebSphere. These are the obvious one, the web containers. And then but like I said, you start looking at Informatica, you start looking at data stage, looking at other database types, and you start just looking. You're looking through the reference architecture for your company, looking for things you think you might be able to tackle that adds benefit. And that's how you have to go forward. Even once you get this button done, you'll find out that there's 100 more things that are still going to need it. But once you have this, and remember before I left testing out of scope, those things now start to seem possible. Because again, I've taken all this noise out of my system. And so now when we start talking about automated testing, it feels like you can do it. A, you got the time. B, you've got this foundation you're standing on that you're pretty confident of. And we've already demonstrated little bits of how automation can trigger and do things and tie it together. So now other people are thinking about ways to make this happen. And it seems a lot more attainable than when we started. Right? Because when you first think about continuous delivery, you're like, my God, there's 100,000 things that go into that. There's no way we can do it all. So that's it for me. I'm short and sweet and to the point here. Like I said, the big thing was we had a ton. The metrics allowed us then to go out and start to have conversations like, do we pay for cloud bees? Let's update to the professional version of the binary manager and look at that. Now I had funding. It was easy to justify the funding to go look at Urban Code or Zebia Labs, right? And we started, all of a sudden with all that, when you start doing 40% savings against the burden labor rate of engineers, you have a lot of money to play with, right? And we could just show, like, if I go do this system, it would be this much. And it was sort of reasonable guesstimates on it. So it was just such a turning point because the whole culture went from, you can't do any of this, to now I can't get enough of it, and we have no problem justifying funding. So I did this for the first 2 years on zero funding. Year 3, they gave me $6 million to say, hey, we want you to do this like a lot, right? And we were conservative. We thought we were going to save them 14 or 15 million. And so we were looking at the next year's budget, but the numbers just immediately justified itself. And it really, just because we were able to demonstrate this, it had a profound effect on the overall culture. And that's the real takeaway here, is it really just made it seem, A, it was possible, because we were doing it. The other things, like continuous delivery, seemed within reach. And we had no problem justifying the money piece. Thank you. Is there any questions? Sure.
Were you using WebSphere platform for deploying onto?
We were deploying to WebSphere.
Yeah. Did you find any useful things with Jenkins to work with WebSphere?
I'll confess that I didn't tackle WebSphere until I got, we ended up purchasing Urban Code at the time. It would be pre-IBM, and they had a WebSphere plugin. And with each of these, it just largely became a matter of having the agent be able to take on the persona of whatever ID owned that, and then start to programmatically attack it. But again, we had a bunch of, the people that supported it were always used to doing things through the console, and we had to start to learn, WS admin or the programmatic level. The good news is I staffed my team almost entirely with young developers because I figured they were like utility infielders. We could just throw them at lots of problems. They would go figure it out. Right? It's like, yeah, go play third base today. All right, go play third base. Anything else? Sir?
How large was your team about how many products did you deploy?
Oh, that's a good question. So that evolved very quickly. So when I inherited the team, it was me and 2 other guys. So it was a grand total of 3 of us. We were supposed to really support 1 platform at the time. 2 more platforms came on as we were on this journey before we had even done our first deploy. And I was, of course, pretty smart. I'm like, well, I can't support a platform if I don't get a person, right? So I got the team up to about 5. Then I became the favorite landing spot of all the college hires. And by the time I left, the team was up to about a dozen. And we were probably doing 20 or 30 of our platforms by the end. And the funny thing is, it took almost 2 years to get to the first button, and then in the next year, it just really takes off because, like I said, you have that added capacity. There's a desire and a willingness. People have seen it elsewhere. They're asking for it in their world. So a lot changed. I should mention one other key thing about this. I think I glossed over it. From the beginning, we engaged InfoSec, we engaged legal, and we engaged audit. Now, audit was, audit isn't used to people making eye contact with them or talking to them. So, there were some challenges, and it took them about 12 months before they would respond to anything I said. They just always look at me like, oh my God, this guy's crazy. But once they started seeing the benefits and they could start to map it into their risk mitigation, right? That's what they're all about, the controls around risk. They got into it. They're reporting to the board, right? So if you got audit going to the board saying, hey, that DevOps stuff Kurt's doing, that's really cool, that's a good sign because that's a great way to get your senior leadership on board once the board tells them to do something. The other thing is, when the other hard community was like the DBAs. I think is this thing on? And just in general, a lot of them put up fights. Well, we can't do that. We're SOCs, or there's going to be a legal problem, or InfoSec. I'm like, well, no, I'm working with them. I can bring them to the table. We can get through that. Because a lot of people try to hide behind things. Anything else? Sir?
Just talk a little bit more about what your compliance process was, or how you kind of folded that into things.
Oh, that's great. So again, back to the thing about the software factory and having those discussions is, with each person we could talk to, and so let's use legal as an example, or let's use InfoSec. It's like, what keeps you up at night, and what do I got to put into my system so you can sleep at night? How do we bake it into it, build it into it? So the first thing I reached out for them, and this was pretty lucky. They had a whole separate team doing all the code scans, right? And when I first met with them, like none of them knew how to build software. There was no developers on that team. Right? There were security professionals writing these awful batch scripts to try and pull out code and get a build and then scan it. And I'm like, I can run that in Jenkins for you. And we showed them that, and then they were like, oh, this is awesome, right? But the whole point was that we're baking their needs right into our pipelines. We're saying, I can guarantee you every time your scans are going to happen. And I also pointed out some obvious gaps, which was, they only ever scanned trunk. The product going out was almost always, in our case, we were a mainline branching, so it was coming off of a branch. So they weren't seeing the scan of what went to prod until after it went to prod. And once I pointed this out to them, they're like, oh, we had no idea. We thought we were seeing the code. I'm like, no, after it's in prod, that's when you see your first security scan. So your sense of a quality gate is post-deployment. Right? I can make it at build time, months in advance of it getting to prod. So it was that kind of stuff, right? And the same thing with legal. So with legal was all about open source licensing. So we were like, how do we bring in the tools that expose all that? We ended up bringing in the Sonatype product and its policy automation. And that, again, it allowed them to sleep at night, right? Because things would automatically break if there was a problem. If somebody pulled in a Pharaoh component, the whole thing was going to shut down, right? So, and then when you just do that with each group, like, what do you do? How do we build it into it so you can sleep at night instead of working at night? Anything else? Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, you need me to?